The novel Frankenstein was written over 200 years ago by Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley. In doing so, Shelley is regarded by many as having created the science fiction genre. Since 1818, Frankenstein has been adapted numerous times, first into stage plays, then silent films, then talkies, and has been in cartoons, TV series, comic books, and yes, there are Funko Pops. So today I'm going to talk about the history of Frankenstein, especially in film, and how it influenced a new world of gods and monsters. I'm Sooper, welcome to my Meltdown. As I've been going through various horror franchises for these videos, Frankenstein has taken the longest for me to get through rewatching various films and write up my narrative, and I think a lot of that is due to the fact that the source material and where things have gone from there since then is a lot more psychologically and philosophically complex than some of these other source materials. And I'm very sure there are aspects that I won't even get to touching on, mostly so this video isn't 12 hours. Also because I've had technical problems and I'm having to completely refilm this. The first film version of Frankenstein that appears to exist was produced by Thomas Edison in 1910. It's a very rough, silent film, adapted loosely from one of several stage plays. It's less than 15 minutes long. The ending is very abrupt, and it kind of seems to imply the creature is literally part of Victor and just disappears forever. It almost feels like it's half Frankenstein and half Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, instead of a straight retelling. The next few films that were made are yet more now lost silent films because the silent era was really not very good with taking care of the product, and there's a lot of it that's just gone, either due to neglect, due to various studio fires. Universal had a huge success with Dracula, and they had not really been doing quite well before that, so they went fully in at that point on being the horror studio, and they started prepping to make Frankenstein based again on a stage production. 1931's Frankenstein and its first sequel, Bride of Frankenstein, are faithful to some of the spirit of the novel, but definitely not the letter of it, and take a lot of liberties. The 31 Frankenstein does a good job of demonstrating that Henry Frankenstein, they changed the name for some reason from the novel where he's Victor, and this seems to be the only version of the story where they've done this in film, and I still don't know why. I've never found a really good reason for it. It's not like even a thing where they don't think that the name Victor is good for some reason and decided to change it, because there's another character in this movie that they named Victor instead. So it's a little weird, but whatever. But they demonstrate that he has this obsession with creating life, and they demonstrate well his horror when that goes wrong. They add in some new things like his lab assistant, Fritz, not Igor. Igor doesn't appear until the third film of the series, Son of Frankenstein, and he's not in the novel at all. This version is also where we got the idea that part of why the creature comes out the way he does is because he's been given an abnormal brain of a criminal, described in the movie as having lived a life of violence, brutality, and murder, which also is not from the novel. Later film versions tend to stick with this in some form, whether because the brain is abnormal.
Abby someone. Abby someone. Abby who? Abby normal.
Or because it was from a criminal, or was damaged before being transplanted into the creature, etc. The general look of the creature, the bolts in his neck, the squarish head, the lightning used as a catalyst to create life, raising him on an elevated platform, a lot of this was invented for the film. The novel doesn't really go into a lot of detail of how Frankenstein was able to create life. This visual from the film, because it was more tangible than what had been in the novel, which was a lot more vague, has been since repeated over and over and over. Boris Karloff's performance, which is totally wordless in this first movie, is really incredible. I'd say it's one of the places where things really depart from the source, though. I think it's a valid modification, as some of the creature's actions in the novel make it a little harder to be sympathetic to him. You want to feel bad for him, and you're meant to in the novel, but He's also portrayed in the novel as having taught himself to read, write, and speak English, German, and French fluently, and extensively studies philosophy, and clearly has a mind, a very well-functioning adult mind. But then he goes on to murder multiple people and frame other people for it, all in this plan he has to torment his creator and ruin his life. He pretty clearly seems to understand cause and effect. And yet there's a thread of literary criticism that insists that he's not culpable for his actions at all. And I just don't agree with that. I know there's a lot to be said about Mary Shelley's life, losing her mother so young that she never actually knew her. She had a very strained relationship with her father because of her relationship with her husband. She lost her first 3 children in infancy. There's a whole discussion to be had about death of the author that is a whole other video that I'm not going to do right now. None of this is to say that Victor is a blameless hero in the novel or that he isn't responsible either. I think there's really no hero in the novel. Shelley saw herself as both a failed parent and a failed child in a way, and I think to some degree she was working through a lot of that while she was writing this, in very tragic circumstances that continued on afterwards. She wasn't letting Victor or the creation off the hook completely, and me trying to fully crack the complexity of all of that in a YouTube video is unlikely. There's no good way for me to segue back from that and all of the horrible life experiences of Mary Shelley to the 1931 film, so let's just pretend that I did a really cool, clever segue, because I didn't. There were cuts made to the initial film. They were requested regionally. Kansas requested so many cuts for it to be played anywhere in the state that it would have had to essentially cut the movie in half. And eventually they relented on some of that. Most of the noticeable cuts that are made in multiple states was a scene where Frankenstein says, "Now I know what it feels like to be God." And though that was before the Hays Code was being enforced in Hollywood, it was still an extreme no-no to say something like that. So that line has since been restored on home video releases, but at the time that was cut out for a lot of the theatrical performances. The other major change is the scene with the creature and the little girl Maria at the pond. They apparently didn't like the shot of him throwing the little girl into the pond and drowning her because they felt it made him seem more monstrous. And it was 1931, showing a little girl being murdered on screen was just not a thing you were likely to be able to do. Even now it's something most studios would likely balk at, and probably rightfully so. So instead, for a long time, the only version most people saw ended with him reaching out toward her, and then it cuts away. And the next scene, the little girl is a lifeless corpse being carried by her grieving father. It wasn't cut in every print, but it was cut in a lot of them, and when it was re-released after the Hays Code was being fully enforced in 1934, it was cut from the original negatives. So for decades, this entire end part of that scene was considered lost. A copy of the scene was found in the 1980s, and it was restored to home video that Universal released in the following decade. And it showed him playfully throwing her into the pond and then reacting with confusion and horror when she drowns. It's hard to imagine why they thought cutting that scene was the better choice, because if anything, without that scene, it makes him seem so much more monstrous, while the restored scene demonstrates that he's basically a child and doesn't understand the horrible things he's doing, which makes it sadder and more tragic, especially with Karloff's performance. And again, the narrative works better there partially because they've removed the bits from the novel where he's extremely intelligent and calculating and intentionally murdering at least 4 people. In this film, the creature does kill 3 people, but 2 are inarguably self-defense, and 1 is an accident. The 31 movie ends differently from the novel, having the monster go directly after his creator, and instead of going through a bunch of proxies first to hurt people around the doctor. Then the creature seemingly dies in a fire at the windmill, and Frankenstein is shown to be injured but alive at the end. They actually have an entire epilogue scene they tack on that seems to just serve to show us that he's not dead. The movie was a big hit, and it then spurred on sequels. Bride of Frankenstein was made in 1935, and it's by far the best of the Universal horror sequels. I think it's better than all of the even original Universal horror movies, and is the best of the entire series. It's also one of the only two sequels that had the director James Whale return for the sequel. The other was Jack Arnold, who created Creature from the Black Lagoon and its sequel Revenge of the Creature, which I will discuss in another video. Boris Karloff was 40 years old when he made Frankenstein, and he'd acted in 80 films by that point, but was still a relative unknown. By the time Bride of Frankenstein was made 4 years later, he was a big enough star that they credit him in the movie as just Karloff. He's like Madonna, only actually British. Bride of Frankenstein begins with a brief prologue featuring the actors playing Lord Byron, Percy Shelley, and Mary Shelley, and it gives a brief, if not entirely accurate, origin story of the author of the novel all this is based on. It then goes straight into the narrative, picking right up where Frankenstein left off. It's also possibly the first horror movie sequel to start with resurrecting its antagonist, which is a trope that lives on in pretty much every horror sequel franchise now. It very definitely departs from the source, but it does feature the book's plotline of the creature wanting a mate and demanding it from Dr. Frankenstein. But in this version, the bride isn't the creature's idea. He gets that from a new character, Dr. Pretorius, who is manipulating all of this to force Dr. Frankenstein to continue in experiments that he no longer wants to do. Everything about Dr. Pretorius, and honestly most of this movie, is pretty ridiculous, but it openly embraces it in a way that is just unapologetically campy and melodramatic, which makes me kind of love it more. It has a lot more humor, but it knows how to place that without it overshadowing the moments of horror or drama, which is something that a lot of directors even now can't do very well, and it's something that James Whale was known for, as showcased in other films of his for Universal, such as The Old Dark House and The Invisible Man. To some degree, that sense is a little missing from the first movie, and it's so welcome here. Will didn't want to make this movie at first, and Universal begged him to do it, so he used that to basically do whatever he wanted, and I think that results in an undeniably better film. This version also features the part from the novel where the creature is wandering a forest and befriends a blind man and learns to speak. Though it's a much shorter version, it leaves out some details, and he's still very limited in intellect and only strings together very short words or sentences. I appreciate how they took Frankenstein's fears from the novel, the reasons he didn't want to create a bride, and show exactly what happens when one of those fears, that he'll create a woman for the creature and she will fear and hate him too, becomes reality. The film ends with the creature destroying himself along with Pretorius, the bride, and the entire castle, because in his words, we belong dead. Initially, Frankenstein was supposed to die here too, but that was changed and reshot to explicitly show him escaping. I think this, and some of the ways he was coerced into creating the bride in this movie, soften his character a little too much, and I think having him die would have been truer to the spirit of the novel. But I understand why a 1935 movie made during the heavy-handed days of the Hays Code would not want to do that. For something made during that period of rampant censorship, this movie still stretches about as far as it possibly can. I distinctly remember the first time I saw this movie as a child, and that ending, and sitting in stunned silence, staring at my TV. The next movie in this series, Son of Frankenstein, was Karloff's last as the creature, and it was the first to feature Bela Lugosi in the role of Igor. It also starred another frequent horror film actor, Basil Rathbone, as Baron Wolf von Frankenstein, the son of Henry. This is the point at which they've really mined the novel for all its content in the previous movies. and started creating entirely new stories for the series. They also reframe the creature as essentially unable to die, which is convenient for making nearly endless sequels. They also return the creature to being unable to speak. I love in this movie how the entire village turns out for Frankenstein's arrival at the beginning in the pouring rain, but only so they can all turn their backs on him and walk away like they're Klingons denying honor to his house or something. I also just enjoy how Wolf von Frankenstein and his wife Elsa both have very proper British accents, but they have a young son with a very southern US drawl. Everyone else is very British, and then there's this little kid who's practically shouting "Yee-haw, y'all" in every scene he's in. This one ends with the creature being kicked into a pit of hot sulfur, and the Frankensteins giving their land to the village and leaving town while the townspeople cheer, which rude. And clearly at this point the creature's body is destroyed, so he can't possibly come back for more. So Ghost of Frankenstein came out in 1942. The town is back to being angry. The creature and Igor have both survived, and they are going out in search of another younger son of Frankenstein. This one is Ludwig. Igor has a secret plan to implant his brain in the creature's body, which doesn't get revealed until after the halfway point of the film, and then doesn't happen until the last probably 10 minutes. At the end, when that happens, it also brings back the creature's ability to speak, but with Igor's voice. It also, though, renders the creature / Igor blind due to a blood-type mismatch between his brain and the body it's been put into. The next movie, Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman, had Bela Lugosi back as the creature, and he spoke throughout and played his part as if he were blind while they were filming, but when the studio edited the final cut, they removed all his lines and any references to his blindness, which is honestly kinda rude. But they'd heard from test audiences that they found the creature with a thick Hungarian accent kinda ridiculous. And, you're watching a movie called Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman. Of course it's ridiculous. This series definitely peaks with Bride of Frankenstein. Side note, as with Nosferatu and the year 2000 movie Shadow of the Vampire, there's a 1998 film that's a semi-fictionalized version of James Whale's later life. It includes bits of him making Bride of Frankenstein, and it's called Gods and Monsters, starring Ian McKellen and Brendan Fraser, and I love it. Unlike Shadow of the Vampire having a twist where an actor is a real vampire, nobody in Gods and Monsters is secretly a mad scientist or a reanimated creature made from corpses. The late 1950s brought Hammer Films into the picture, and they made a series of Frankenstein movies starring Peter Cushing as the Doctor. And starting with Curse of Frankenstein, they then followed that with Revenge of Frankenstein, The Evil of Frankenstein, Frankenstein Created Woman, Frankenstein Must Be Destroyed, a sort of black comedy that was a remake of Curse that was called Horror of Frankenstein, and finally, Frankenstein and the Monster from Hell. They're sort of the polar opposite of the Universal films in two major ways. One is that the Universal movies, the through line is the creature itself recurring between movies. And in these, the through line is the Doctor instead, and he's creating new creatures throughout the series. The other way they're very opposite is that Peter Cushing's Doctor is unapologetically, unambiguously evil. He is intentionally murdering people. There are no soft edges to him. He's without any doubt the bad guy, and every creation he makes is simply a pawn for him to kill more people. They even add in a subplot to make sure it's very unambiguous that Victor is evil, that he's had an affair with one of his servants. He gets her pregnant, and when she tells him that she's carrying his child, he essentially says, "You've slept with half the town, nobody will believe you anyway," and then gets the creature to kill her to keep her from telling anyone about it. He's not just a misguided scientist who goes too far in this. He's downright sinister and slut-shaming women that he's sleeping with. In the 70s, there were multiple very different Frankenstein adaptations or Frankenstein-adjacent works.
I see you shiver with anticipation.
First was 1973's Dan Curtis TV production, which was very similar to his Dracula film with Jack Palance. It was filmed on video. It looks like a cheap stage production a lot of the time. It's not very good. It's not really worth discussing, but it certainly exists. There are less dramatic extreme close-ups than in Dracula, though, so it's got that going for it. Or maybe going against it. I'm not really sure. Next was 1974's Young Frankenstein, which is a loving satire of the Universal films mostly. It has plot elements of the first 4 of those films all mashed together in a way that's strangely coherent. It even uses some of the original lab equipment from those older films, which is a nice touch that makes it feel like a direct sequel that just happens to be a comedy. This is probably one of the best spoof or parody films that's ever been made. It has a few bits that haven't quite aged well, and in rewatching them, they're honestly hard to defend, but the rest of the movie is pretty great. Then came 1975, which saw the release of one of the most long-lived successes to be loosely based on Frankenstein. It's the Rocky Horror Picture Show. This could be the subject of its entire own video, and it's had an undeniable effect on popular culture. It's also the only adaptation of Frankenstein that I've seen people perform parts of in a Safeway parking lot at 11 p.m. They were clearly just practicing the time warp for a midnight showing somewhere, but still.
It's just a jump to the left.
One of the most next significant versions of the story is 1994's Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, directed by Kenneth Branagh and starring Kenneth Branagh as Victor, and with Robert De Niro as the creature. It takes a few liberties, but it's more or less one of the most book-accurate versions that's been made. Despite that, it's not one I personally like very much. It's sort of like Coppola's Dracula in fidelity to the source, but where the Dracula has a lot of ridiculous, over-the-top, batshit visual flair, this Frankenstein just feels sort of dull in comparison. They're taking the material very seriously, and it's almost too serious for me to enjoy it. Sidebar, after this movie came out, I saw a few reviews complaining that it was really inaccurate because it didn't have Igor. And it was kind of delightful to see paid film reviewers unintentionally telling on themselves that they hadn't read the novel while pretending to be experts on faithfulness to the novel. 2012 saw the release of Tim Burton's Frankenweenie, which was a remake of a live-action short film that he had made in the 80s, but this was all animated. It's underrated, and I really think that it's a lot of fun for fans of old monster movies, Godzilla movies, etc. There's just so many references in it, but it's also its own thing, and it has some heart. I hadn't watched it in several years after I had initially seen it in a theater, and then I watched it again after my own dog had passed away, and I had a lot of unexpected feels because I had forgotten about certain plot elements. And by unexpected feels, I mean I sobbed like a child. Like, I cry sometimes at movies because I am a functional adult who isn't afraid of his own feelings, but I cried so much at this. And I still love it, and I think it's probably one of the best things that Tim Burton has done since the 90s. But fair warning, just if you have get very emotional about hurt pets, you might not want to watch this for a bit. In 2014, there was a movie called I, Frankenstein released, starring Aaron Eckhart, which I never saw, and I heard was really bad, so I went to look it up and see what it was even about. In 1795, Dr. Frankenstein creates a monster, a soulless creature patched together from corpses, and then rejects it, disgusted with what he's made. That sounds like the novel. In a fit of rage, the creature kills Victor's wife, Elizabeth, and Victor chases it to the Arctic to get revenge, but succumbs to the weather. That still sounds like the novel so far. It's pretty faithful. The creature buries his creator in the Frankenstein family cemetery and is then attacked by demons before being rescued by the gargoyles Ophir and... Wait, hold up. There are gargoyles in this? Nobody told me. I have to say I'm very upset at all my friends who know how much I love gargoyles have failed me like this. How dare you all? I mean, it still sounds pretty terrible, but I'll literally watch anything with gargoyles in it. Apparently, the original plan was for this movie to eventually cross over with the Underworld movies, but then it bombed hard, and the Underworld series has been slowly waning anyway, so that just never happened. Since then, 2015 had a version that updated the story to modern times and had Carrie-Anne Moss as a version of Elizabeth who teamed up with Victor to create a monster that they then were using to kill people or something. And there's a version called Victor Frankenstein that has Daniel Radcliffe playing a very pretty version of Igor because reasons. Since then, there have been a few of their cheap versions made, but nothing really memorable. Universal still makes noise about specifically doing a Bride of Frankenstein remake as part of their Dark Universe, that they're still kind of trying to revive, but maybe not, and with the industry as it is right now, with COVID, who even knows anymore? So that's Frankenstein movies. Most of them tend to soften the arc of the creature by having him only kill in self-defense, or seemingly not know what he's doing. Some soften the Doctor a bit, but then some of them harden him a lot, and the Hammer films take a drastic left turn by the end of that series, but Peter Cushing is pretty excellent as the Doctor. I think it's pretty clear that, unlike with Dracula's, I do have a favorite of these, and it's the classic Karloff movies. Some of the others are good, but those stand out for me. Granted, I'm a nerd for classic Hollywood, so anyone who knows me is not surprised by this. Most importantly, all of these movies, starting with 1931, contain the idea that part of the reason all of this went wrong is because they used an abnormal or damaged brain. So what are you waiting for, science? You've had 90 years to figure this out and create life eternal, an end to pain and death. We have... If you want to argue with me about the monster's level of culpability in the novel, do that in the comments below. You can like and subscribe to my channel if you want more of this silliness, and as always, thanks for coming to my meltdown.